It's fantastic to see so many people here. Welcome, everyone. I'm Frederick Eberhardt. I'm co-director of the new Center for Science, Society, and Public Policy, together with my colleague, Mike Alvarez. This is our first event. We're really excited to see this many people here. In my role as administrator, I do have a few administrative points, unfortunately, to get us started. So, firstly, the good news. We have a reception afterwards, just across the, out the building, across the walk in Dabney Gardens. You're all welcome. And there was some nervousness about whether we have enough food and drink, and I think that's going to be a good problem to have. So I'm really glad to see you all. Everyone's welcome. The reception starts at the very end after the panel discussion. Second thing is restrooms are one floor down if you go up and one floor down. And also, if you really need to exit, please use the back exits if you can, not across the stage. It would be a little bit of a pity to interrupt the event like that. And last thing is to manage the Q&A for Kevin Roos in between. We are going to do this online. We're going to try it. Maybe it won't work. The QR code is there. Scan it or log on. We will collect the questions. We won't be able to take all questions, and we're going to select the questions that were upvoted most. So take a look. We're monitoring the questions while it's going along. And I will ask those then. Let's see how many we get through in between the presentation and the panel discussion. Okay, with that, I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. I'd like to welcome Caltech's President Tom Rosenbaum to open the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. In Frankenstein, Mary Shelley writes, "You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." This has been the tenor of a good deal of discussion about the rapid developments in artificial intelligence broadly and generative AI most recently. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural event of the Caltech Center for Science, Society, and Public Policy, where we will dive more deeply into the issues surrounding artificial intelligence and machine learning. We believe that scientific knowledge and technological prowess are essential to any meaningful evaluation of the impacts of AI on society. This is true for the positives and for the negatives, whether it be life-saving improvements to health screening, powerful tools for artistic creation, and new ways of approaching science, or potential upheavals in the job market, propagation of false information, and new weapons of war. Only through this type of informed evaluation can we amplify the salutary aspects of technological development and counter its dehumanizing capacity. It is this calling that we obey. My thanks to Michael Alvarez and Frederick Eberhardt for leading Caltech in this promising new direction, to our expert panelists representing disparate perspectives but sharing a commitment to rigorous inquiry in service of society, and to our distinguished keynote speaker, Kevin Roos, for framing today's discussion.
I would like to welcome the panel up now for the discussion, and Kevin and the panelists will be at the reception afterwards as well, so you're welcome there as well. It will take us a minute to get all the mics switched over, but stay tuned. Thank you. Also, thank you very much for the Q&A. That seemed to work really well. For the Q&A at the end of this session, we will actually have microphone runners, so over to Mike
Alvarez. Co-director with Frederick. But again, thank you for coming, and thanks to Kevin for coming today. He actually took time earlier today to spend a little bit of time with a whole group of our students, which was a wonderful opportunity for the students at Caltech. And thanks to President Rosenbaum for his remarks and for being here today with us as we kick this new center off. So with our roundtable, we're going to do it a little bit differently. Of course, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation here with our experts. I'll introduce them. I'll have a couple of questions for them. We'll go back to the old school traditional way of people raising their hands for questions, and we'll run the microphones up. We didn't know whether the QR code experiment would work, but it seems to have worked brilliantly. First off, we're going in alphabetical order. My colleague at Caltech, Anima Nandakumar, who's the Bren Professor of Computing and Mathematical Sciences at Caltech. We have Sean Comer, who is the Principal Technical Artist at Activision and Infinity Ward. We have Justin. Sorry, I skipped over. Justin Levitt. I'm not going to miss you. Professor of Law at Loyola Law School, and Carly Taylor, Security Strategist at Activision. So Jennifer Wright, who's on the program, she couldn't make it today because of illness. She regrets not being here, but we'll get Jennifer here sometime in the fall. She's from Cambridge University Press, and we'll have another conversation sometime in the fall about academic publishing and really the implications of these new technologies for academic publishing and academic research. So we'll start with Anima. Can you tell us a little bit about how you are using generative AI especially in your research, and what you think of as some of the limitations of the existing technology?
Sure. First of all, I think it's great that we have this new center, and it's very timely and very much speaks to the interdisciplinary nature here at Caltech, right? So Mike and I have been collaborating for many years, ever since I came here, and been using AI to study social media, and even like classical approaches like topic modeling for extracting topics at scale from Twitter data has been very effective. And so that's the nature with which the new center will really help us advance in this, place where generative AI is taking off, but also all the implications on society it has. And Kevin, did an amazing job covering all of that. So I do want to first emphasize, what makes generative AI different from the AI we've seen in the previous decade, what I'll call predictive AI, right, was that they were geared towards one specific task or a few tasks. So you trained on specific objectives, and the goal was to maximize the accuracy on those. Whereas with generative AI, the goal is to be able to generate new samples. So by nature, it is creative, right? Because it has to randomize and think of new combinations of the underlying concepts. And that's what makes it so powerful, because once you have that capability, you can do all kinds of different downstream tasks. And so I think there are a lot of open questions. Kevin mentioned about the possibilities in sciences. This is something we've been really extensively working on here at Caltech, right? So to think about not only text or image data, but all kinds of other scientific domains. AlphaFold is one, how do we learn to fold proteins, but also how do we learn to generate new genome sequences. What we did over the last few months was to be able to generate new variants of coronavirus before they appeared. So instead of text, you now have the genome sequence, and you learn what could be implicitly the fitness functions of new variants. And we can do the same with also all kinds of other complex multi-scale processes. Because we think of text as something humans understand, and then the AI is able to mimic that and come up with new ideas, right? But AI can go much further and understand processes that we have huge difficulty in doing so. I think about complex weather patterns. So we are able to do weather forecasting about 45,000 times faster than current weather models, using frameworks that can capture different scales of information and really be able to predict both medium range as well as long range forecasts. And I think these are the capabilities that are just at the cusp. Just as we have to deal with climate change, think about mitigation strategies. How do we capture carbon dioxide and store underground? How do we plan for the right reservoir and the right amount to store? So these kinds of complex processes that our human minds cannot even grapple with, we are using AI, and we're doing it much faster. And along with it comes benefits of being able to come up with new discoveries, new inventions. For instance, we just released a paper on being able to design a new medical catheter that reduces bacterial contamination by about 2 orders of magnitude. Again, using the principles of physics, using fluid dynamics, and how bacteria can contaminate and swim upstream, but also using that in the process of AI designing now better catheters and other better tools. So to me, this is just the beginning. There's just enormous potential by thinking about generative AI that is multimodal, that is multi-scale, that can really come up with new creations and still be physically grounded in the laws of physics and everything we want. Yeah, so I'm very excited about this future.
Great, thank you. So Sean, in the game development business, in the game development area, how are you all using these technologies, and what are some of the issues that you're encountering with the technologies, both on the personnel side, but on the technology side?
Right. Well, thanks for having me here today, by the way. And so yeah, I specialize in machine learning, and I sit inside a technical art department. So what does that do? We build tools for both artists and engineers to meet the production demands of game development. There's a growing demand for content by our users, and we need to meet that. Some of the use cases for this currently that we've developed in our pipeline, it revolves around character synthesis, multimodal search, character synthesis, recommendation engines, and most important of all, documentation. Now, having said that, we strive to look for human alignment with our tools. Nobody, as Kevin pointed out, nobody wants to be competing with a machine in a fulfillment center anywhere, right? So we look to, like, humans have intent and purpose, and they do their jobs with intent and purpose to reach goals. So we're looking to supercharge that and give people a productivity boost and just generally engage more satisfaction from team members and make more engaging content moving forward. Now, with all that, it is still early days, and we are moving very cautiously and responsibly with respect to this technology. And yeah, we're assessing everything and just moving slowly, but that's more or less the vector we're heading in.
So can you be a little more specific about why you're proceeding cautiously?
I think that there's a lot of open questions with respects to where this is all headed, where our IP sits, and how it could be potentially affected by this. So I think those are some of the more serious concerns that we have.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So Justin's our lawyer. Our lawyer. And you know, the technologies, we chatted about this a little bit a few weeks ago. These technologies are obviously changing the nature of how we teach, how we practice what we practice, in particular in the area of law, how you teach law, how you practice law. But if you don't mind following up on what Sean just talked about a little bit with respect to intellectual property, what do you see are really the emerging issues here with respect to some of the issues about intellectual property and copyright as well, which Kevin raised?
Yeah, so first I also want to convey thanks to you and to Caltech and to Kevin for a magnificent summary. And second, I also want to do a mic check. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Thank you for that.
Good. This is an easy question to answer because the answer is everything but one thing is a developing area of the law. The only one thing we know, and we don't even really know that yet, is that the Copyright Office has said that if your product is wholly generated by a large language model, it is not copyrightable. But outside of that one extremely narrow slice, that leaves an immense amount of questions that the law isn't quite built for yet. They've said that human arrangement of things like ChatGPT output is potentially copyrightable. They've said that human editing is potentially copyrightable, and then there are a whole host of questions about how far do you have to go down before you reach the thing the machine did versus what you edited, and at what granularity the copyright folks are going to look. There are virtually no rules about, well, there are no rules other than the default of copyright protection for copyright works, and as Kevin mentioned, what does that mean when you feed a copyrighted work into a model trained on a whole set of copyrighted works? What gets spit out very well might contain copyrighted material, and how do you avoid that without knowing what the input was and how it got translated to the output? The current regime doesn't really it's built on very old rules. And so it doesn't really provide workable, meaningful protection on the other end because it's not meant for these machines. Every once in a while, law changes based on the tech. Copyright was built because we had printing presses. We didn't need copyright before we had printing presses because nobody was really concerned that you might sit down and copy an illuminated manuscript once or twice or 7 times and dominate the market. But as soon as we had printing presses, now all of a sudden we have to decide who gets allocated the right to ownership of their work. And this might well be a technology that changes the way we think about legal application in this zone. So we know one thing, if the machine did all of it, you can't protect it under our current system of copyright. And by the way, Congress can change that default anytime it wants. So that's today's answer, not tomorrow's. But absolutely everything else is an open question.
Thank you. Open questions. We love open questions. So Carly, I know that at Activision, one of the issues that you're constantly grappling with is to try to police people from cheating on the gaming platform and various types of undesirable behavior. That's something we've actually been partnering with you on. Can you talk a little bit about how you use these kinds of technologies, AI and generative AI, in that line of work?
Yeah, absolutely. Mike's good? We okay? Awesome. First of all, again, thank you for having me. Very thankful. I do have housekeeping really quickly to say. I do work at Activision, but I don't speak on behalf of Activision. So just a little bit there. And Kevin, since you're sitting right in front of me, I need you to blink twice if the Activision lawyers are right behind me. Just kidding, they're very nice. They didn't follow me here, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm a woman, but I'm also a gamer. And I also make content for LinkedIn, which I like to call the most absurd of social medias. But as a woman and a gamer, it's very interesting. It's something that you face a lot, right, is this idea of toxicity on the internet, especially in gaming communities. And it's something we think about a lot. I was just reading recently about Discord actually has been integrating generative AI into their auto moderator tools. And Mike, we've talked about this a lot. There's such a thing as moderation fatigue, right? The kinds of people who have to read the horrible things that people say to each other online every day, it's an exhausting job. And so anything like that I think you can help with moderation, you can help with the efficacy and the speed at which you get bad actors out of situations where they're causing harm, I think is a net win. There's certainly things to be said about colloquialisms and what certain groups, talk to each other like and whether that's toxic, right? And those are outstanding questions that we have. Is an AI better than a person who has an understanding of the way people might communicate? And on the toxicity front, this is actually really funny because I just spoke at the Game Developers Conference about a new technology that we've been working on. And it's actually, we called it hallucinations, but it has nothing to do with the way that ChatGPT likes to hallucinate. But I guess it's kind of similar where we're putting fake players into our game, and it's a little bit of a honeypot for cheaters. But when you start to build something like this, and you're saying, I want people to believe that this entity is human, well, then what does that mean to imitate a human? And so what kind of behaviors do we learn about how people behave that we could use to put back into that model to better imitate a person, to be indistinguishable, and then be, an even more effective way to catch people doing the bad things?
Great, thank you. So now open question for the group. Earlier, Kevin talked a little bit about some of the risks, and I think he framed it as the risk that the nagging feeling you feel in your stomach, right, kind of risk. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what each of you thinks of as some of those risks. Are they the little nagging thing in your stomach, or are they things that keep you up at night with respect to the use of generative AI? So it's an open question. Feel free to jump in. Do I have to call?
I mean, I got lots of things to keep me
Go ahead,
up.
start, Justin. Yeah, please.
I don't sleep very much.
Are they nagging, or are they the keep you up at night
It's
kind of
always the
questions?
lawyers.
Yeah, well, right. This is a professional problem. So I think there are problems that those who are working in or with AI should be feeling in the nagging pits that they maybe haven't discovered yet. And I think there are problems that all of us should be feeling that many of us have discovered already that Kevin talked so eloquently about. Generative AI is a tool. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad, it can be used in a mismatch where the people who are using it don't understand what it's producing, and so there's a disconnect that causes some problem. I've heard it described eloquently thus far in some of the early language models as your drunk friend sitting in a bar who's super smart. And that has, there's a lot of questions I would want to ask that guy, but there's a lot of questions I wouldn't want to ask that guy, and a lot of caveats I want to put on what that guy's telling me. And if you've seen, by the way, the video productions of generative AI that are now circulating on the web, not for professional use, but sort of fun things like pizza and beer commercials, they're your very drunk friend sitting at a bar. What keeps me up at night, what should keep AI developers, I think, up at night, is that we haven't figured out the allocation of responsibility socially for what happens when the tools either get intentionally misused or unintentionally misused. And the legal system default is if there's a foreseeable harm, you might be on the hook for it. And as Kevin just walked through, there are foreseeable harms absolutely everywhere here. That's part of the reason why social media went to Congress to get a blanket exemption, and many other industries have gone to Congress to get blanket exemptions or rewriting default liability rules. So that this happens in guns, this happens in social media, this happens in lots of industries where there are known problems, is you go to Congress to get a different baseline than we have now. So one problem is people haven't realized yet what they might be on the hook for when, for example, in the beautiful transgender kid compassion example, right, they go for affirmation, but what happens when ChatGPT feeds that same kid something that causes that kid to harm his or herself? Right? How do we allocate responsibility for that is a question that where the only models aren't very satisfactory now. The other pit of stomach thing is for all of the rest of us, and that's the disinformation, misinformation, reality collapse. I mean, Kevin mentioned this. I was nodding along. I'm an optimist in a lot of ways, but I'm nodding along with the pessimistic takes. I'm a democracy guy. That's the field in which I operate. And democracy depends on a set of different opinions and a set of common facts. And generative AI is going to be great for giving us an infinite array of disparate facts. And that's a disaster for democracy.
Nima, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. You know, there's just a whole can of worms, right? And now, I mean, we have to deal with it. I think to me, the main worry is a lot of people assigning it human-like qualities, you know, whether treating it as a drunk friend or a guru or a therapist, whatever it may be, right? It's not a human, but it is, you know, really so hard for people when they're deeply engaged in the conversation to think of it as a machine. And I think that's where everything starts, right? Whether it's like a kid looking for, you know, like kind of support there, or even there was the case of somebody, right, committing suicide and his wife saying that was because of this chatbot. I think we'll see a lot more of those cases, and to me, that's the slippery slope. It's great if you can use it only for editing as a tool, right? But it's really hard not to get sucked into thinking that it's another being. It's another one with feeling, but it has no feelings.
Sean?
The thing that maybe gets to me is maybe worker displacement. And once again, I work at Activision. I don't speak on their behalf. This is my personal opinion. But I don't necessarily think it's going to outright take jobs away. I think jobs are going to be different. And are we as humanity or as a group of people, are we going to be resilient enough to reinvent ourselves when our jobs become different? Now, looking forward even further, like as life expectancy continues to rise, how many more times are you going to be able to reinvent yourself? Is that, I think, maybe on average right now, is it maybe once or twice a lifetime? How many more times is it going to be? And can we handle that load?
Carly?
Well, I'm messaging ChatGPT every 6 hours and saying, are you evil yet, or are we still friends? No, but yeah, I think I don't know that it even concerns me so much as I haven't fully wrapped my head around the fact that 6 months ago, the baseline for humanity's creativity and arguably our cognition was just raised to a level playing field for a lot of people and was raised really high for a lot of us. Like, I'm also not an artist. And so that for us, I think, has implications that we haven't even begun to digest or understand, because how could you, in the short amount of time that we've had to face that? You know, on the one hand, I think it's great because you think about the distribution of what people are capable of, right? It's like a Gaussian distribution of all of us. But the tail ends of this are really what are hyper affected by some technology like this. And it's, you know, like Kevin was saying, it's like the white collar workers are now the ones being affected. And I think that's interesting. And I'm almost excited to see what happens there, because I don't know that that's ever happened in the history of humanity that I can think of. And it will be curious to see how leaders actually lead through this, if they do. Yeah, and I think, I don't know, can't say if it's going to be good or bad, but it's going to be something.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is going to be something, because, you know, we've encountered in my own research lab just over the last couple of months, the graduate students, postdocs are all using this technology. And just last week, one of our students was using ChatGPT to try to figure out how to update one of our servers, and I think somehow managed to crash the server for the better part of a day or two. It wasn't ChatGPT's fault, it sounds like, but still, ChatGPT is somehow implicated in this. So what kinds of things in particular I'd like to focus on organizations and what they're doing in response? Caltech, Activision, Infinity Ward at the law schools. What are organizations doing to try to think through some of these risks, if at all? And maybe what kind of policies are starting to be put in place to maybe mitigate some of these risks? So maybe Sean, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so we're taking things very slow. As Justin pointed out, it's kind of a minefield out there. And you know, we want to do things right, and we don't want to put ourselves and our employees at risk. So yeah, we're just moving very cautiously and with rigor as this is like rapidly expanding. We do, however, as a game development studio and multiple studios that make up Activision, we produce an immense amount of data. So it actually gives us an opportunity to think about it from the other side. So what do we want to do with this data? How can we benefit our team members positively with these tools and this information? So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Carly, in your experience at Activision, a similar story?
I would say yes. And from what I've heard from friends at other game studios, it's very similar. You know, everyone's getting probably weekly emails saying, like, don't put our IP into these chatbots. You know, don't ask it to do some top secret work for you. And I think that guidance is absolutely necessary. But it's so exciting to see how many of our employees are chomping at the bit to start using this in their day-to-day work. And I think that people are realizing, and they're excited, and automating away the parts of their jobs that they don't necessarily love doing isn't scaring them. They want to be able to do more of the things that they like doing, right? Where it's not transcribing an interview. Now you're actually like getting into the heart of what you actually were talking to someone about. And I think that for all of us is an exciting point. You know, I don't want to have a job just to have a job where I'm doing something that is routine and boring, right? I've had those jobs before where I pretend like I'm working and I sit around all day and it's extremely boring. And so I'm of the mind that I think that the challenges will come and they might be difficult, but I don't think it's anything we can't overcome together. But again, it relies on good leadership. And so I'm interested to see who amongst, you know, our CEOs as a collective in the United States or in the world, or, you know, anyone in leadership pulls ahead and makes these decisions of how are we going to empower people with these tools and not just cut, replace, and leave people out, you know, on the side of the road. And I think that will be the differentiator.
So Justin, in the law school, what are you all doing in terms of conversations among the faculty and how you're either using or not using or limiting the use of generative AI?
Yeah, so I think two different ways, internally and externally. Internally, you know, our dean walked into the first faculty meeting of the year And you all will be able to see this coming. You know what the end of this story is now already based on where we are, but he welcomed us, and then he started talking about the year ahead and the semester ahead and then he later revealed that he had written the entire thing using ChatGPT in 3 seconds. And it is increasingly popular to produce this in meeting as a little trick, but it's also a warning in that it sounded every bit like, not him, but a generic law school dean welcoming a faculty to the first faculty meeting of the year. It was indistinguishable from an average, not pointing at Kevin because he's average, because he pointed out to us that the language models are built on average prediction and therefore fairly generic until you tell it to do something exceptional. And so what we got was average, hi, welcome to the semester. And that's going to also affect every single one of our students because they will be replaced by the completely generic average. One of the things that kills me about Kevin's slides is the ChatGPT performance on the bar exam. Not because I'm surprised, because it confirms something that I've been frustrated about the bar exam for ages about, is that it doesn't measure what it takes to be a lawyer. So the fact that ChatGPT did really well in the bar exam, of course it did. But they call lawyers counselors because the service we provide isn't multiple choice answers to tricky legal questions. It's actual one-on-one counseling about, in your circumstance, what should you do based on the following factors. AI may get very good at that, but it's not there yet. And all of our students will be better served if they use generative AI to help them in that, rather than replacing them. So we're teaching our students to be equipped with the tool and to cut down on the disconnect between what they think it can do and what it actually does. Externally, just very quickly, lawyers are also keen on being, law professors especially, keen on being policy advisors. And so we are working with institutions like Caltech and a lot of other institutions around the country and trying to figure out what some of the rules of the road might be going forward. I will say, I think nobody's got the answer to that yet, but we recognize that there are helpful regulations that could be put in place, and even if we don't know the content, it's worth thinking about what those might be. So we are very actively involved in that too.
So, Anima, at Caltech and NVIDIA, what kinds of limitations do you see that either we're talking about or we're not talking about or we might need to put in place?
I mean, I think Caltech and other educational institutions have a huge role to play, right? Especially as these models are getting more behind closed APIs and there's more also publishing restrictions in a lot of the companies. I think educational institutions are the ones that can do a job in terms of being fair, unbiased, having a balanced assessment of different model capabilities, right? So, like to Kevin's point of either overhyping or anti-hyping, right? Both are, what is that middle ground? I think educational institutions have a big role to play. But of course, they cannot do it in isolation because these large models, none of the institutions have the computational infrastructure and the engineering capabilities to train from scratch. There are some open models, but they're still not at the biggest scale, right? So how do we partner with the right companies that can help, bring these models? We've been partnering with NVIDIA to help test for bias, how to come up with these automated strategies for large-scale bias testing in these models. I think those efforts have to grow, and even the White House announced the effort to have like this red teaming, like carefully assessing the capabilities of the model. Because now what we see is on social media or other forums, like you only see a small part of the capabilities of the model, right? And everything that is published is only by those companies. So, we haven't had an unbiased assessment, and to me, that's a very important starting point to do everything from there on. Any kind of policy decisions and everything have to be informed by that.
Right, so I think we've mentioned regulation a couple of times. The R word has come up. Kevin mentioned it as well. And at the White House yesterday or sometime earlier this week, they had this big confab with the White House and industry leaders to talk about regulation of AI. And it didn't seem like it was a super productive outcome in the sense that the White House said you all ought to be putting up the guardrails and the industry said you all ought to be putting up regulation. So it didn't seem like there was any real outcome from this meeting. But What do you all think should be the role for the federal government here, if any, in terms of at least starting to think about regulation? So Justin's smirking, so we'll start with you.
I'm only smirking because I actually think the meeting yesterday was far more productive than might have been thought based on that particular outcome. Of course, industry is going to walk out and say, give us guardrails, and of course the White House is going to walk and say, industry, give us guardrails. But the point of the meeting wasn't to walk out with a bill. The point of the meeting was to say, we're watching, we know we're watching, you know we're watching, and please help us through this, because there will be regulation coming, and we'd rather have you engaged in that process than not engaged in that process. Because the product's going to be better, actually, if the people who actually know what they're doing and know where some of the limits and the problems are and where some of the benefits might be that you don't want to cut off, are engaged in the tailoring of that regulation rather than leaving it to random chance or letting ChatGPT write the regulation itself. I think that the role of the federal government ought to be in helping essentially rewrite and put more meat around Kevin's pessimist scenarios. And then saying to industry, how do we write the rules that still allows you to be creative while avoiding the going to kill us all scenario? And putting a real red line around the box that's the kill us all scenario, because we'd really rather regulation head that off. I think that keeping an eye on and helping better articulate the problems to be steered around and asking industry to focus on that rather than the opportunities might be a really productive use of federal government. That's something that I know, for example, Lena Khan has used in her powers, the FTC, in a different context, that same approach to regulation. Here are the problems, help us figure out how to avoid these problems while doing a good job of preserving the flexibility you want. I think the alternatives are things like blanket bans on liability for firearms manufacturers, which I don't think serve either firearms manufacturers or governments or citizens very well. And so the default is a non-informed, overly blunt solution. And so federal government helping to reach a more nuanced solution seems like a better way to be.
Okay. So you mentioned transparency, Nima. Do you think that there's a place for federal regulation that can help us get to a point where the models can be more transparent, we can understand them better, we know what goes into them? Is there a place for federal regulation in this area?
Yeah, I think so. It's very important to have like the right testing regulations, right? And that cannot be done broadly. I mean, if we say for all of the chats that ChatGPT can do, that's impossible. But that's why we need focus. I mean, I think specific domains, if it's giving medical advice, certainly, it's the FDA, right? But now we need to modernize FDA, and, what is the role of like chatbot providing medical guidance, right? So what should be the guardrails there? Or especially, mental health and playing a therapist, right? So these are the, specific, I think, and there are lots and lots of those use cases, right? So, but we need to kind of go into each one of them and think again from the priority of safety, which ones are the most safety critical we start with, and then we go down the line. And everything else too, like copyright, I mean, everything needs modernization. I know that's a much harder one, because if there is just one rule that just fits all, that would be ideal, but that would be way too blunt, and I think that would either give blanket just approval for everything going wrong, or it will just overtly throttle progress. So, we have to be much more nuanced, and that takes a lot of work.
Right. So, Sean, on that front, do you think that federal regulation will help alleviate some of the uncertainty that you've talked about, being conservative in your use and application of these technologies?
Yeah, I think regulation, the pros outweigh the cons in this instance. It will definitely give us a clear path forward, and it will be less expected to traverse this minefield that we have right now. Just like, also with respects to like traceability of the data that it was trained on, I think federal regulation is going to play a big role there to make sure everybody has their fair share of whatever commercial avenues other companies are taking, and if they're these models are trained on large chunks of the internet, just to make sure that everybody has their work protected, essentially. Also, like, I mean, how do you protect those people too? You can't just move everything behind a paywall, right? Like, so much high quality information out there is stashed away behind paywalls, and all this low quality information is out there for free, and basically like polluting the well. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's a situation that I think we're going to be forced to deal with.
Okay, and it will help, may help force you.
Yeah.
It may help you deal with it. So,
Yeah.
Carly, thoughts on this?
I'm interested. Yeah, I think I agree with Anima. I'm curious about what it would take to understand these large models. I think that's gone. I don't think we can. I think you'd need another trillion parameter model to ever understand why these models do what they do. And I wonder if, in that way, we've gotten so far ahead of ourselves without stepping stones of explainable AI, without regulations about bias in AI. I work in machine learning, and I haven't been doing it very long. I know people who've worked in it for 20 years, and there's still no regulation there, right? Like, the time to regulate this was yesterday. I think this outcome of models getting bigger and bigger, right? Looking at a neural network when we were just working with vanilla neural nets a couple years ago, the inevitable outcome was that these had to get bigger to do the things we wanted them to do. Now, should we have looked in a crystal ball and seen this coming? Perhaps not, but since we haven't regulated anything thus far, how are we going to understand what needs to be regulated now, and is it too late?
So the challenge is it too late? That's great, thank you. The last thing before we turn to questions from the audience that I wanted each of you to discuss, if you can, is, and I think Kevin mentioned, the role that these technologies can play in generating misinformation. And as a political scientist by training, I'll tell you, we have a big election coming up. What do you think about the weaponization of these technologies in the 2024 election? So Anima, let's start with you.
Yeah, like, we have collaborated on using AI to understand information online, and as a corollary, misinformation as well, right? Trolling and all of this behavior. And yeah, the bar to generating that is so much lower and so much easier. And, I think, yeah, so we'll see a lot more of that. The question is, how will people react to that, right? What we've seen in the past is, and again, there are other experts who study this, but what I think is, some group of people will just completely believe this, right? And so we'll see more of that polarization. And the question is, what is the way out of that? I don't know. I am very pessimistic on this. I wish I had a better answer, but maybe others do.
John?
Yeah, it scares me. Yeah. I think on an optimistic point of view, maybe it gives us the elephant in the room to address the attention economy, which a lot of misinformation stems from, right? Maybe it just boils to a head and it's a necessary evil that forces us to deal with these things. Like I said before, this is trained on a large portions of the internet. The internet isn't that accurate to begin with. Now we're aggregating that information and generating more out of it, right? So, I mean, we all know where it's kind of going. Like, you can use it for good, you could use it for bad, but you also, like, you always have to check your resources, or check your sources and what it feeds you. Yeah, I don't have a really good.
Except pessimism. Okay.
Yeah,
two votes for pessimism.
Yeah,
Now,
pessimism.
democracy guy.
Democracy guy is not going to be your third vote for, not going to be your vote for optimism.
Not going to get
That's
optimism
true.
out of
No,
democracy guy. Okay.
I mean, you will see a lot of super fun, magnificently creative, deeply dystopian campaign ads produced using generative AI. So it's going to be wild. And that's the only upside I can think of. there will be a lot of creativity fostered in this coming campaign cycle. And as a guy who enjoys creativity, that's great. As a guy who enjoys democracy, not great. As Sean just pointed out, if the default is a little bit inaccurate at best, if you're talking about generic not being used for evil, there is also a fairly significant population, including not folks inside this country, but who want to wreak havoc on the American electoral system and have a desire and now exponentially expanded means to produce information that many of us will be unable to distinguish from real, that is false. And not only false, but designed to pit us against each other and to pry us away from what we think we know. And that's terrifying. I'm fond of saying in 2016, there was a lot of worry about the Russian government hacking the electoral system. And they did, but they didn't hack the machines, and they didn't hack the voter registration databases, and they didn't hack the ballots. They hacked us. We are the weak link. And they figured out how to exploit the ways that people are vulnerable and did it extremely well without the use of generative AI. Fast forward, now we've decided to hack us, right? This is no longer a problem coming from outside the house. This is very much inside the house. And now there's a tool that allows us to hack us much better. I think that both Sean and Nima are exactly right about the solutions to this are longer term. They're demand focused rather than supply focused. They're civic literacy. They are building connections between each other. Isolation is one big way that misinformation spreads. They are Robert Putnam and bowling alone. And all of the ways that we fix that are big and societal and long term. And the problem is here and now and exponential. So sorry to make it 3 for 3.
3 for 3. Carly?
4 for 4.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you're completely right. Like, we're sitting on Caltech, arguably one of the best research institutions in the world. All of us in this audience would probably say that we consider ourselves above average intelligence, right? All of us are capable of being bamboozled, and no one wants to admit that, because all of us have the ability to be tricked, and we have confirmation biases. And not only that, we have spent the last however many years telling Facebook and telling Instagram and me telling LinkedIn every single day what exactly we are biased towards and how we think. And so we've put that out into the world, and that's completely exploitable. And it's so easy for ChatGPT to do that. It's shown, I mean, trivially, it can do that.
Actually, true story, I used ChatGPT for 3 minutes on the way over here. Not on the way over here, parked at a stoplight on the way over here. And had a stream of election denialism that quickly. Some of the prompts, you actually need to get a little creative to have it feed you bad information or harmful information. Not that one.
Right. Okay, so 4 votes for pessimism. Thank you for being patient. And we now have time for questions from the audience. So we have a couple of microphones. And unfortunately, Frederick, it looks like all the questions are in the back. The first couple of hands were up in the back. So there we go. Thank you.
What I'm hearing is that we're going to be living in a world without trust, except for what I'll call intimate personal relationships. And so I think if we're talking about regulation, we need to look at that foundation. How does the world function without trust? The famous kind of advice, trust but verify, has no relationship to making regulations for ChatGPT.
Can you repeat?
Sure.
Go
ahead.
So 3 seconds on that is I think institutions are the answer. I think Michael was getting at this before. We not only trust individuals, we trust institutions. And I'll look to our journalists as a filter for the information we get that some of us have developed deep trust in that has to be rigorously maintained. But the connections we have are built into structures, and if we can manage to trust the structures to deliver us what we need to get by, we're not in bad hands. It's not just up to each of us individually.
Over there.
So my question is kind of about the feasibility of kind of self-regulation for these companies. You know, when the White House says, like, please regulate yourselves, be responsible, given that all of these companies seem to be in a pretty massive arms race with the whole market share of, like, the AI thing, whatever this is, on the line, how can you trust them, or, like, how can they kind of restrict themselves when, if they don't, they're going to get beat by the next guy? That's my question.
Nima.
Yeah, well, I mean, knowing people from almost all of these companies, right? So ultimately it comes down to people who are working on this, and I know they have the best intent, right? So, but at the same time, the problems are massive. First, getting all of this internet data to begin with that has all this toxicity, bias, these aspects, and then trying to build guardrails on top, because like just curating through all that was impossible. So we just went ahead, trained the models, and now we're trying to put a Band-Aid on top, and that is just very fragile. And there are lots of ways to jailbreak that, some much easier than others, right? So I think it's like that collective one. So I wouldn't put the blame on all just the companies, or even give them the responsibility to self-regulate. I think most of them, I would say, are fairly clueless on how to do that. And especially at times where, the ethics and other policy teams are being laid off in some of these big tech companies, right? So I feel like they're not the right people to look towards. So that's why we need, the broader community to contribute. And I think the Red Team effort by White House is a great starting point there.
Right. Yep.
Hi, how's it going? Thank you for taking my question. I guess my question is a bit more broader on the individuals who are going to be moving into the future, or I guess all of us that are going to be using this technology. Currently, when we do searches online, when we look at news media, it's kind of curated to what we're looking at. So we kind of get fed back what we put in. So I can kind of see how this can project further with AI. And the question is, how do we solve that problem of self-isolation, more like internalizing your own projections into media, news? I mean, I'm too young to know Johnny Carson, but people used to just watch him on TV. Now we don't have that unifying force anymore. So how do we deal with that as a society moving forward?
Sean?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I think there used to be a part of the news cycle, this may even predate me, but where they would give oppositional opinions, right? Or a variety of opinions on what happens, and encourage and engage healthy debate, and good things could bubble from that, right? At least it would force compromise, and nobody was happy with it. With respects to what you get from a search or a response from a chatbot, I think it needs to offer up a diverse set of opinions that are constructive, not destructive. The great ideas come from the collective failures of all of us, right? So moving forwards, I think whatever regulatory body that we decide governs this, that needs to be embedded in these systems, essentially. I hope that answers.
So you want a chat GPT that instead of giving you the answer, it gives you multiple answers. It sounds like Google again.
Yeah. One of the great things about ChatGPT is it puts you on a vector. It's a weak vector, right? But it gives you a starting point, right? I think it would be helpful to offer multiple starting points.
Okay, great idea.
Hi, my name's Tessa, and I work in the undergraduate admissions office. And so over the past 4 admission cycles, I'm not actually going to talk about writing essays with ChatGPT, if that's what you're thinking. We're thinking about that. But I've seen a real increase in the number of students talking in their applications about their interest in ethics in AI. And I've seen that grow over the last 4 years. And I'm wondering, how do you approach, for professors, discussions about ethics and the importance for ethics in the sciences, but then also for folks at Activision with young professionals? Yeah.
Great. So professors and yes, and Frederick, we do have someone who teaches a class in the ethics of AI. I don't know, but we won't, he's already had his time. So, but let's start with Justin on this one.
I don't think the ethics of AI are different from ethics, and so they start with a training in what it means to be human, essentially. And learning about some of our worst impulses helps us reorient to some of our better ones. And that, too, is a very old training technique. It's also true that much of ethics, at least traditional ethics, is based on intentionality. And one of the big problems with AI is it cuts out intentionality out of the center. It takes the aggregate of all of the things that people have done or said and moves them to an output without the intentionality in the middle. And so you have to, in essence, teach people to understand that what they're receiving is the received product of a whole lot of intentionality, even when there wasn't an actor doing in the first instance. That, in the law schools, we've called this structural racism and have been teaching it for a very long time. So it's not that different from translating the world of AI. And yet we're still grappling on how to teach this effectively, and even more important, how to teach people what to do with that broader cognizance once they get out into the world.
So Carly, how are you mentoring people on your team, for example, with respect to the ethics of using these technologies?
It's interesting because we've never sat down, I think, and had this conversation, and I think that brings up a good blind spot for me, that I've never talked to my team explicitly about this. I've kind of trusted them to use their best judgment, and perhaps that's how you find yourself in a situation where you wish you would have had a conversation sooner. So, I will say that. But I'll also say I've talked about leadership a couple of times up here, and I do think that part of moving forward in the world as we see it now is that companies are going to have to be intentional about what their missions and values are. And these aren't just the words you write on your wall or that you tell to people when you're recruiting them. You have to be intentional about this. And at every step, you have to be mindful about what your mission and values are. And as soon as you start straying from that as a collective or as a leader, you end up in a position where it's bad for everyone, not just your employees, but it can have big knock-on effects to everyone in society.
Thanks for the answer. So we have time for one more. Where is it?
Hi.
Right there.
This has been a very terrific discussion, a lot of very interesting points, and honestly, I'm having a little bit of trouble phrasing this as a question specifically, but one thing that came up for me is thinking how today's problems were really yesterday's solutions, and we've seen that with plastic pollution, we've seen it with carbon emissions, we've seen it with social media and privacy, and this was an issue where it seemed like Congress was about to start, making some decisions on this issue when they were just caught off guard by ChatGPT. And so it's interesting for me to hear that the industry doesn't want to really take the lead on self-regulation and rather looking towards the federal government for regulating, when the federal government is so slow that we didn't have privacy legislation, so California had to step in to kind of lead the way. So just taking that into consideration, and also, for example, how the credit card companies have created a standard for cybersecurity. I'm just wondering what other models are there for this. As this other gentleman pointed out, the industry is moving so quickly. If they're motivated by profit, they don't want to slow down, but we have to force this intentionality into there. So if we're not looking towards governments, can we have consortiums or federations or some kind of alternative model?
Well, Nima, I think you spoke to this already in a sense. I mean, could you talk a little bit more about how, like for example, what role can Caltech play or the academic researchers play in trying to help, I don't know if it's called regulation, but help guide the development and use of this technology?
No, absolutely. I mean, this is where researchers need to extrapolate, right? Like kind of think about what could be the downstream effects. I mean, we've seen that with climate change. There's the whole body of researchers, looking into policy, looking into all these impacts that can happen. So I think that's to me a good role model to also apply for AI, right? And we've been doing that over the past decade, but now the timeliness of it is even more important, as well as the capabilities of AI, right? I think this is the challenge for those who study at the intersection of policy and AI is to, what do you assume the AI to be? Is it all capable or not at all capable? What kind of mistakes it could do, right? I think that kind of modeling of how AI could evolve has been a challenge because no one expected that we would have this fast progress. But now that it is there and we have a better understanding of the broad range of things AI can do, I think we should focus also on to modeling its impact on society. So, doing that systematically and then coming up with ways to, come up with meaningful regulations or guidelines or best practices, whatever that may be. And again, I'll go back to emphasizing testing of these models, right? Having access to models, being able to test them, being able to extrapolate how they could work at scale when they're interacting with vast parts of humanity. That's how we move forward.
Great, thank you. So with that, we'll end. We're going to carry the conversation on over in Dabney Gardens. There's a reception just right across the way. And please join me in thanking our panelists for the conversation today. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks.